Well, this is our final session for our series in the book of Zechariah, and we're up to chapter 12, right through to chapter 14, so three whole chapters, and uh, this is the final section of the book, and all the commentators tend to agree this is all one complete unit, so possibly a prophecy that Zechariah gave in one address or wrote down in one go as the Lord gave him these visions. And if you've read it through, you're probably thinking this is a very hard section to comprehend. It doesn't maybe seem to flow that well. There's lots of different types of imagery that might be confusing to our modern Western 20th century ears. But it will help us before we dig into it to see how this section is actually structured, how it's all put together, because there is actually a logic to it, and we need to kind of put our minds into the minds of people in the uh, centuries before Christ, over 2,000 years ago, to get an idea. As it's been seen, the whole book of Zechariah itself is structured in two main parts, like the ancient Assyrian writing tablet. The first part is these 8, 9 night visions, and the hinge was that looking at the reflecting on the time of the exile and looking forward to the time of restoration. This second section of Zechariah that we're in contains two oracles or burdens which have the theme of the king that God is promising to send, who will uh, restore all things. And each of these oracles is separated by that little parable we saw enacted by Zechariah, where he played the role of a worldly or two worldly shepherds to illustrate that the Lord is the good shepherd, and he is nothing like those worldly shepherds that they were fearful of, the kings and the emperors of the day. So now we've come up to the second oracle of the king, and you'll see there's kind of the three main ideas. That's not necessarily the actual structure of the section, but the three key ideas there: that the Lord will defend Jerusalem, he will condemn the false prophets speaking lies to the people, and his king will come and will be the means through which he will rule over his people and over the whole earth. So let's look at how this whole section is structured before we go into the details. Uh, what we'll see is that this section actually does have two main sections to it with a hinge, so to speak, in the middle. So the oracle itself is split into two parts, and we'll see an introduction to each of those two parts of the oracle, and we'll see that the oracle is about a siege of Jerusalem. Then in the middle section, and remember the Hebrew literary structure of a chiasm, where often the key idea of a passage is right in the middle, and the song of the shepherd king is in the middle between these two halves of the oracle, and we'll see that that's really the key, the central idea, so to speak, of what the Lord is going to achieve and how he will achieve it in all the things that he's talking about. Now, the section before this and the section after this are the bits that are hard for us to get our heads around because of our 20th century thinking. But the key, really, to understanding how this oracle is structured is a little phrase that occurs 16 times, 9 before the song and 7 after. Uh, the little phrase on that day. And so the theme of this whole oracle is a day, that day. The idea here is what the other prophets, some of the other prophets, refer to as the day of the Lord. It's the day when the Lord will bring both his final judgment and will complete his work of salvation. It's the day when all of his promises will come to completion and fulfillment, and uh, it'll be the culmination or the consummation of his purposes in history. Now, the prophets, as they looked forward through the path of history, for them it was like looking at the end of a broomstick. So from their perspective, the day of the Lord was a day. It was a one act, one time in history when everything will be done in a very short period of time. At least that's from their perspective, looking down the view of history. But when you actually come to the day of the Lord, what we find in the story of the Bible is that we see, well, yes, they were looking at the end of the broomstick. We now see that it's actually not a day as much as an age. And the age, the day of the Lord, began with the arrival of Jesus, and it will be completed at his return. So what the prophets saw as a day is for us a long period of time, beginning with his first coming and being completed at his second coming. And so, with these 16 images of this day, they'll tell us about, they'll point forward to what was done in Jesus' earthly ministry, his first coming, and what will take place at the end of the age. And knowing these two things, the beginning of this age and the end of this messianic age, will give us certainty because we see what God's done in Christ, and will give us hope as we look forward to the completion of what he's doing, knowing that we're situated somewhere along the timeline of this messianic age. Something else we need to bear in mind is that obviously this is written for the people of Zechariah's time, and so he'll be describing things in their framework using images that they are familiar with. And as we look at each of these 16 statements about the day, we're not meant to look at the fine details of them as if they're going to be literally played out in a historical way or in a timeline of events. Each little snapshot is supposed to give us an impression, a little bit as if it was a 16 faceted jewel, and as you turn it, each face as it rotates catches the light and lights up just for a moment, and then you turn it and then you see the next face, and so it's like 16 snapshots, 16 impressions of this day of the Lord. And so when we've seen all 16, we'll have this overall impression of the nature of what God is going to accomplish in Jesus Christ, because it is all pointing forward. And we'll see as we go a number of references and places where these 3 chapters of Zechariah are quoted or alluded to in the New Testament, which will show us how it's all fulfilled in the person and the work of Jesus Christ. So let's go straight into it, and we'll read the passages, the sections of the passage as we go along. So make sure you've got your Bible there. Keep it open as we work through it. Zechariah 12, verses 1 and 2. The oracle of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth and formed the spirit of man within him. Behold, I'm about to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering to all the surrounding peoples. The siege of Jerusalem will also be against Judah. Now, notice there how the Lord introduces himself, both as transcendent, he's above all things, he made everything, and he is immanent. He is close to us. He's the Lord who is sovereignly working out his purposes in the heavens and the earth. He's the creator. He has the right and the power and the authority to do what he pleases with his creation, and he's working everything out on that massive scale, bringing everything and creation to its goal. Yet at the same time, he formed the spirit of man within him. So he knows us as people, and he values his people. He loves his people. So as he's working out everything on that grand scale of nations and kingdoms and the whole of creation, he's doing it all with the goal of doing good to his people out of love for his people. So he's great enough to accomplish anything, but he's also close enough to save and protect and to care for his people in the midst of what he's doing. And he's working all things together for the good, ultimately, of his people. Now, they need to know this because of verse 2. This coming day, which will be judgment. He says, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup of staggering. And the image there is someone who's reeling as if they're drunk because they've been hit in the face, so to speak, with God's judgment. What God is about to do in and through Jerusalem, his people, is going to make the nations reel because they'll be so astounded by what he does. Now notice that God's judgment is always just. He's never vindictive. He doesn't fly off the handle and just lash out because he's upset or angry in the way that we are. All that he does is always with the perfect goal of bringing perfect justice. So this judgment that comes that makes the nations real, it'll be just, it'll be fair. Everyone will get exactly what is deserved for their evil and their wickedness. Now this would be shocking, this verse, because what he's describing here sounds like what happened 70 years earlier when Nebuchadnezzar came and laid siege to Jerusalem. Now, why this is shocking is because we've just had 11 whole chapters of the Lord encouraging his people to get on with building the temple and looking forward to the day they'll rebuild Jerusalem, and all of his encouragements and promises that they will be successful in building, that he will come, he will dwell amongst his people, and there will be peace and security, and people will return to the land. There'll be prosperity. Their enemies will be cast aside, and so they've had 11 chapters of looking forward to what they seem to would believe is the Lord bringing a solution and a resolution to everything, and now he says there's going to be another siege against Jerusalem. So at this point they're thinking, "Hang on, Lord, what's going on? What are you talking about?" And that's what we'll see as we go through this passage, what he's actually talking about, and what we'll see is the New Testament fulfillment of these chapters will show us that the Lord's salvation will be different to what they're expecting. In the New Testament, what we'll see is that these ideas of the kingship of David's house and of the city of Jerusalem, of the land, the identity of the true Israel are all, in a sense, redefined. And what it'll show is that these geographical, political expressions of the people and the land and the kingship, they're just types pointing forward to the reality of Christ and his people living and reigning in the new creation. And that's the impression that we'll be given as we work our way through these little snapshots of that day. So let's go through the first 9. So the first one, in fact, I'll read this next section from verse 3. On that day, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all the peoples, and all who lift it will surely hurt themselves, and all the nations of the earth will gather against it. Actually, we'll just read each view of the day as we get to it. So the first view is this day. It will be something so significant that all the nations will notice it, but no one will be able to comprehend or control it. It'll be like a heavy stone that you can't lift. If you try and lift it, you hurt yourselves. That should remind us, if you know your New Testament, of when Jesus talked about himself as the stone. We've seen it already in Zechariah, the stone that the builders rejected. And he says anyone who tries to resist this stone will be broken by it. You can see that in Matthew 21:44. Verses 4 to 5 then. On that day, declares the Lord, I will strike every horse with panic and its rider with madness. But for the sake of the house of Judah, I will keep my eyes open when I strike every horse of the peoples with blindness. Then the clans of Judah shall say to themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem have strength through the Lord of hosts, their God. So in this little snapshot of the day, God's enemies will have their strength broken. Their horses will be struck with panic, and there'll be madness, then there'll be blindness. But God's people will have security because the Lord, who's called here the Lord of hosts, so the Lord who has his own army, he will see clearly and be able to protect his people amidst the panic and the madness and the confusion. Verses 6 to 7. On that day, I will make the clans of Judah like a blazing pot in the midst of wood, like a flaming torch among sheaves. And they shall devour to the right and to the left all the surrounding peoples, while Jerusalem shall again be inhabited in its place. And the Lord will give salvation to the tents of Judah first, that the glory of the house of David and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not surpass that of Judah. So here's an image of a fire that's kindled in the midst of wood or among the sheaves, the sheaves of dry wheat, and the fire spreads out and burns up God's enemies. But Jerusalem in the middle will be left untouched, and they'll be safe, and God's people will dwell there in Jerusalem, and there's a picture there of them living all as equals. The glory of David, the house of David and Jerusalem won't surpass that of Judah. So the regular people out in the land of Judah will be equals with those living in Jerusalem and even of those of the royal family of David. Verse 8. On that day, the Lord will protect the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the feeblest among them on that day shall be like David, and the house of David shall be like God, like the angel of the Lord going before them. So the image just before had this idea of equality between all the people. Here we see it from a slightly different perspective, where we see, well, the people will actually be led by the house of David, or by a descendant of David himself. But see, they won't be led as if they're servants. They themselves will be like David. So they will be reigning with this king, this descendant, this son of David. Verses 9 to 10. And on that day, I will seek to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem, and I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him, as one mourns for an only child, and weeps bitterly over him, as one weeps over a firstborn. So here's a picture of God's people who have been redeemed, who have been saved from their enemies, but they're mourning. This is a picture of repentance. They're repenting for the way that they have treated the Lord. It says, when they look on me, the Lord, on him whom they have pierced. And they'll call out for grace and mercy. So this is a picture of the Lord bringing them to a place of true repentance, wanting to be restored in relationship to him. Now we're told in John 19:37 that as Jesus was on the cross and the soldiers were coming to take down the bodies to see if they were dead, and they found that Jesus was already dead. To make sure, though, the soldier thrust his spear into Jesus' side, pierced his side, and blood and water flowed out. And John makes a comment there, John 19:37, that this was to fulfill the word of the prophets that says, they shall look on him whom they have pierced. So this is very clearly telling us that this passage, not just this verse, but this whole passage is pointing to Jesus. Jesus is the Lord whom we have pierced by hanging him on a cross and putting him to death. But the result of seeing that, when we see the cross and we see that there is our God, the Lord himself, hanging there, bearing our sins, then his love and his kindness shown in that will lead us to repentance and receiving his grace and his mercy. Right, verses 11 to 14. On that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad-rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. The land shall mourn, each family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the house of Levi by itself, and their wives by themselves, the family of the Shimeites by itself, and their wives by themselves, and all the families that are left, each by itself, and their wives by itself. So again, this theme of mourning is continuing, but it's focused on these different houses. And if you notice, there are three categories of houses there. There's mourning by the house of David, so the royal household. There's mourning by the house of Nathan. Nathan was the prophet at the time of King David. So here is the household of a prophet. And then the houses both of Levi, and Levi was the head of one of the tribes who became the priestly tribe, and the Shimeites are the descendants of Levi, and so they are a priestly household. So what we see here is the royal house, the prophetic house, and the priestly houses are all mourning. Why? Well, presumably because their positions and their roles have been taken away from them, or maybe even that the men, the kings and the prophets and the priests have all been slaughtered in this siege. But either way, it's the offices of prophet and priest and king have somehow come to an end. Verses verse 1 of chapter 13 then. On that day there shall be a fountain opened up for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from sin and uncleanness. So a fountain produces flowing water, living water, and it will provide cleansing. When someone who was unclean had to go through the ritual process of being made clean again, they had to wash in running water, not just water in a bowl or in a well, but it had to be from a stream or from a spring. This flowing living water from the fountain will provide cleansing from sin and uncleanness, and it will purify both the royal line, the house of David, and the people themselves, the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Verses 2 to 3 of chapter 13. And on that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will cut off the names of the idols from the land, so that they shall be remembered no more. And also I will remove from the land the prophets and the spirit of uncleanness. And if anyone again prophesies, his father and mother who bore him will say to him, You shall not live, for you speak lies in the name of the Lord. And his father and mother who bore him shall pierce him through when he prophesies. Quite a graphic picture there. But this is a picture of idolatry and false prophecy being removed from the land, to the extent that not even parents will tolerate idolatry or false prophecy from their own children. In verses 4 to 6, on that day, every prophet will be ashamed of his vision when he prophesies. He will not put on a hairy cloak in order to deceive, but he will say, I am no prophet. I am a worker of the soil, for a man sold me in my youth. And if one asks him, What are these wounds on your back? He will say, The wounds I received in the house of my friends. There's some things there that beg a bit more explanation, but we haven't got time to go into the details. But again, it's about prophecy, and I think here it's talking about true prophecy, saying prophecy itself will come to an end because it'll be no longer needed. Why? Because all prophecies will have been fulfilled. There's no longer going to be any need for ongoing revelation or prophecy, because everything is fulfilled and can be seen what the Lord has done in keeping his promises in Jesus. So they're the first 9 views then of this day, the day of the Lord. And we come now then to this central song, the song of the Shepherd King, showing how God's people will be saved in the midst of this terrible time of judgment that is to come. I read from verses 7 down to 9. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third into the fire and refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, They are my people, and they will say, The Lord is my God. So we see in verse 7 there that this shepherd king will actually be struck down by the Lord himself. God's own sword will come against his own appointed shepherd king. He says, This is the man who stands next to me. In other words, this is the one whom I approve. He's at my right hand to do my bidding, so to speak. He's actually fulfilling his role as my representative. But he says, my sword is going to come against this man to strike this shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. Now, Jesus told his disciples in Matthew 26:31 and Mark 14:27, parallel accounts. Jesus says to his disciples, you're all going to fall away. And he says, the reason is because it is written, and then he quotes this verse, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And that actually took place when the soldiers came to arrest Jesus. We're told all of his disciples fled. Peter and John followed from a distance, but they all fled to avoid being arrested with Jesus. So again, here's a New Testament reference that tells us that this thing that the Lord is going to accomplish through striking his shepherd will actually be accomplished in the death of Jesus. Jesus comes as the good shepherd, but he's deliberately and willingly given over and struck down to die and to bear the sins of the people. There's echoes here of Isaiah 52 and 53, where God talks about his servant, in whom his soul delights, but this servant bears the transgressions and sins of his people, goes through great suffering in order to take away the people's sins. That's the image that's been given here. The shepherd who is struck down, who lays down his life in order to save his sheep. So in verse 8 then, we see that 2/3 shall be cut off and 1/3 shall be alive. There's a picture there that some will be lost, some will be saved. More will be lost than will be saved. So maybe a majority will not be saved. And again, we see this played out in the New Testament, especially through the book of Acts. We see that initially a large number of Jews received the gospel, at least 5,000 or many more than 5,000. But over time, as the gospel continued to be proclaimed and as it went further out, the majority of the Jews actually rejected the gospel, rejected Jesus as their Messiah. So a large number came under judgment because they didn't receive their Messiah, but there's still the third, the remnant, so to speak, who received him and was saved. And in verse 9, we see this remnant. Not only are they left alive and saved, they didn't just survive, but they are to be refined like silver and gold, to be perfected, to be shown to be the true Israel, those who live by faith in Jesus, their Messiah. Romans 11:5-6, Paul is wrestling, or has been wrestling with this fact that many of his own people, the Jews, are rejecting the gospel. And he talks about that, and he says, so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace. But if it's by grace, he says it's no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would be no longer grace. So Paul is saying, even as he's writing Romans many years after he himself became a believer after Jesus, that God is still being faithful to the Jewish people. There are still Jews who are being brought into the kingdom, but overall, they will be the smaller portion of the whole of God's people that he will make his own. And we'll see that in the second part of the oracle, which begins in chapter 14. So let's read the introduction to this second half, 14 verses 1-3. Behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, and the women raped. Half of the city shall go out into exile, but the rest of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations, as when he fights on a day of battle. So again, uh, this is the shocking statement that Jerusalem is going to be laid siege. There's going to be a terrible judgment that will come upon Jerusalem. And it sounds again like the days of Nebuchadnezzar, uh, but there's a reminder here that in that time of terrible judgment, some will still be saved. So it will be a time of judgment, but also a time of salvation through judgment. Okay, let's look at the remaining little snapshots, little views of this day. I always forget to click through. There we see those references to Jesus being struck by God and how he redeems the remnant of the Jews. Well, let's look at verses 4 to 5. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mountain shall move northward, and the other half southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal. And you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. So here's a picture of the Lord himself. He's come to fight for his people. He will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is just to the east of Jerusalem, and split it in two, making a path, a clear pathway for his people to escape the siege out of the city, to escape off to the east. And then once they have come out and fled, he will go with them, with his holy ones, with his army. He will come behind them to protect them and to keep them safe as they flee. Verses 6 to 7. On that day there shall be no light, cold, or frost, and there shall be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night. But at evening time there shall be light. This is a strange day. It'll be as if time has stopped in order to make sure that everything is accomplished. This is reminiscent of the story in Joshua 10, when the sun stood still while Joshua and the armies of Israel fought against their enemies. The sun stood still in the sky until they had won the victory. So here's that picture. God is prepared even to stop time, to stop the sun in its course, to make sure that everything he said he will do is accomplished. Verses 8 to 9. On that day, living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea, and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer as in winter, and the Lord will be king over all the earth. Now the eastern sea is the Dead Sea, east of Jerusalem, and the western sea is the Mediterranean Sea. And so here's a river of water flowing from Jerusalem, watering the earth, making the salty seas fresh. And in the context of that river flowing, the Lord will be king over all the earth. In Ezekiel 47 has an extended vision of this same thing, where he sees a river flowing from the temple and rejuvenating the Dead Sea and bringing life to the earth. And then John in Revelation 22, 1 to 4, as he's looking at this new Jerusalem vision, he sees a river flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb, and on its banks are the tree of life and The leaves of the tree are for the healing of nations. So here's this picture of this living, healing, life-giving water flowing from God's throne in Jerusalem to renew the earth, to renew creation. Verses 9 to 12. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name one. The whole land shall be turned into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem shall remain aloft on its site, from the gate of Benjamin to the place of the former gate, to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's winepress. Zechariah's hearers and readers would have known all those different locations. And it shall be inhabited, for there shall never again be a decree of utter destruction. Jerusalem shall dwell in security. And this shall be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are still standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths. So kind of a twofold picture here. One, a beautiful picture of Jerusalem, and then this terrible picture of people's flesh rotting and their eyes rotting in their sockets. This is kind of a picture that should make us think of the final judgment, when the Lord is the absolute undisputed ruler over the whole earth. The Lord will be one, and his name will be one. Only one king. And there's this picture here is of this huge plain, Geba in the north of Jerusalem, Rimmon in the south, a plain of about 10 kilometers in radius surrounding Jerusalem. That's a picture in the ancient world of a city on a hill, and if it's surrounded by plains, they can see any enemy coming from a long way off. So it's a picture of absolute security. But then there's a picture of judgment. The enemies are judged. So this is a picture of final judgment, where God's people will be saved and his enemies will be judged in a final way. Verses 13 to 19. And on that day, a great panic from the Lord shall fall on them, so that each will seize the hand of another, and the hand of the one will be raised against the hand of the other. Even Judah will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations shall be collected, gold, silver, and garments in great abundance. And a plague like this plague shall fall on the horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, and whatever beasts may be in those camps. Then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come up against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the feast of booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up and present themselves, then on them there shall be no rain. There shall be the plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the feasts of booths. This shall be the punishment to Egypt, and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the feast of booths. Okay, strange picture here, a confronting picture, because we've just saw in the previous view that all of the nations that come against Jerusalem are going to have their flesh rot and their eyes rot, and they're going to be judged. And here we see a picture of this judgment on the nations, but in the midst of this judgment, we see those who are saved out of the nations, who survive, and these survivors come and worship the Lord along with his people in Jerusalem. Even Egyptians, and they will celebrate the Feast of Booths. He's highlighting the Feast of Booths here. This is the feast that particularly remembered the days of the wilderness wanderings, the journey that Israel had between coming out of Egypt and coming into the promised land. So it goes right back to the time when they were rescued from their greatest enemies of the time, the Egyptians. And here we have the Egyptians who wanted to destroy them, now reconciled and worshipping with them the Lord. The Feast of Booths, we see that when Jesus came to Jerusalem, for the Feast of Booths, that was the occasion when he stood up in the temple and cried out, "Come, and if anyone is thirsty, come to me and drink," because it was a remembering of the water that came out of the rock in the wilderness. He offers living water. So again, there's that idea of the river flowing from Jerusalem. It's also during that festival that he stood up and he said, "I am the light of the world." So the Feast of Booths was a festival where all of Jerusalem was lit up, reminiscent again of the pillar of fire that led led Israel through the wilderness and gave them light at night time. So this is a beautiful picture actually of those redeemed from out of the nations, the Gentiles, coming and being united with the Jews and worshipping together in in the Lord's temple. And then verses 20 to 21. And on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, "Holy to the Lord." And the pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar. And every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall no longer be a trader in the house of the Lord of hosts. So we can see we've been brought right through to the end of the age and the beginning of eternity, of the new creation, when everything, even everyday objects, the bells on horses and the pots and pans in the kitchen, everything will be inscribed with "Holy to the Lord." They were the words that were inscribed on the gold plate that was on the front of the high priest's turban. So all of life will be worship to the Lord. Everything will be used for worship, for the glory of God. And we're told there'll be no more traders. That's a reference to the temple no longer being desecrated. Remember how Jesus, we see it in all four Gospels, Jesus comes to the temple and he clears the temple of those who are exchanging money and selling animals for sacrifice. He clears the temple of traders, preempting that day. He's doing it in fulfillment of this verse in Zechariah, but it's preempting the day when the worship of God will be pure and nothing will ever be able to defile that pure worship of God. And then notice his last words, the last words of Zechariah on that day. And he doesn't say anything more in this 16th view. He just says, this is the day. This is the day that you, the Lord's people, need to have as your focus. Looking forward to that day. And now for the people of Zechariah's day, it was looking forward to the coming of the Messiah. And as we've seen, that all came to fulfillment in the coming of Jesus and all of those New Testament references we've seen where he's fulfilled these verses. For us, it's the same but different. We look back to the beginning of that day when Jesus came and showed that he's the fulfillment of everything, all the promises, all the prophecies. But we're somewhere, as I said, somewhere along that broomstick between the beginning of this day and the conclusion of this day when Jesus returns. So we too need to keep looking forward to what Peter calls in his letter. He uses this term, the day of the Lord. And when we're looking forward to when Jesus returns, he makes everything new. There'll be a new heavens and there'll be a new earth, and all of God's fulfilled promises in Jesus will come to a completion. So we have this wonderful certainty as we look back to the cross and all that Jesus has done, and we have a wonderful hope as we look forward with a guarantee, because God has done all of this in Jesus and we can see it done. We have the guarantee that the end of this age, the completion of this day in which we're living, will come, and it will usher us into the eternal day, the day of the new creation, when we'll be clothed in immortality. And all of these little snapshots, these views of this day that we've seen that have been framed in the terminology of this world, we'll see the reality of that when Christ will be reigning, and we will be reigning with him, and we'll see him face to face and know the fullness of joy as we are with him.